And counting. Nicely timed. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming again. Most of you know me. I'm Bob Rulli, the Director of Planning and Community Development. I'm joined by Arnold Robinson from Fuss & O'Neill and Paul Edelman from Union Studios. Erica from Union Studios. Some of this you've seen before. We're going to quickly go through what we covered in the first two workshops. This is the Market to Metacom initiative. We're fortunate enough to get a grant through the SNEP program to look holistically at addressing sea level rise and climate resiliency in the Market Street area, but then also looking at where there was economic development opportunities in the Metacom corridor. The feedback that we have gotten to date has been extremely positive. We've got incredible amount of interest from the federal delegation. In the last 3 weeks, both Senator Reid and Senator Whitehouse have been in Warren, walking the area with us and trying to understand, what it is we're doing. We've got a number of projects that are teed up that, hopefully with the infrastructure bill and some of the resiliency bills that will have additional funding available. But this is a holistic approach in terms of how a community can look at one area where there is a problem and then another area where there's opportunity. And so thank you for coming tonight. Through our process, the first piece was, getting as much data collection as we could. This is the third of 3 public workshops that we've done. Prior to starting this process, we were fortunate enough to have a grad student, Patrick from URI, that provided us with over 100 maps looking at any number of different scenarios, from various sea level rise scenarios, storm surge scenarios, to who owned the property and where they were from. And that all is helping us as we move forward with this. As we conclude this portion of the grant, we're looking at other opportunities and trying to move forward with different initiatives that we're talking about, which are, phase relocation, restoration. And then we also, tonight, we're going to talk about what if we don't do anything. And that's not really a good scenario, but that is a scenario that we need to look at. And when we're done, we'll hopefully have a final report that we'll be able to issue in December timeline. So we have first workshop was in May. You can go through this pretty quickly. This is the project area. It's from Market to Metacom, and it's Metacom to the Bristol town line. 184 acres, 400 buildings, 700 housing units, and 30 businesses. We looked at what the assessed property values are. It's almost $380 million in assessed value. 586 parcels with an average value price of $236,000. The amount of annual taxes that are generated in this project area is just over $2.4 million a year, which is pretty significant. As you see on the flood zone maps, blue is bad. We have a lot of blue. When we look at Metacom, where again, Metacom is not vulnerable to sea level rise, but Metacom, from a planning perspective, as I'm fond to say, represents the very best in 1950s, 1960s planning, where we have lots of one-story park in the front buildings. So we see a lot of upside in terms of future development there. We are in the process of updating our comprehensive plan so we can make zoning amendments. Our thought is people are displaced from the Market Street area, we can create more housing opportunities in the Metacom corridor, but also we can create workforce housing opportunities, more mixed use opportunities, more business opportunities, and improve that area as a transit oriented development area. So that's, the second piece of the holistic approach to how we've looked at this project. Again, if we look at what the land use is now, even though it's zoned business commercial, it really doesn't lend itself to that. So we think that, there are significant things we can do with respect to zoning changes. We'll be adopting form-based code, which will allow developers an expedited development process, density bonuses for creating workforce housing, but just trying to, again, eliminate kind of the need to get in your car to go someplace to shop or, to travel. So, one of the frustrations we have is that you come into Warren, it's a 2-lane road. Suddenly you get to Arlington and Metacom, it becomes a 4-lane road. Suddenly get to the Bristol Town Line and you're back to a 3-lane road. So we think a 3-lane road is better. We can have enhancements for bus traffic, for bicycle paths, and just the whole pedestrian experience. Yeah, the assessed value in that area is almost $60 million with 116 parcels. The largest parcel and kind of the grand dame of what we look at for our visioning purposes is the Ocean State Job Lot Plaza. That parcel is over 8 acres. Most of that is a parking lot and one-story building. So this is not a criticism of Ocean State Job Lot. We just think there's a higher and better use there. And later in the presentation, we'll give you what our concept plan in terms of what could happen there. The annual amount of taxes that is generated from that area right now is almost just over $1 million. As an example, and again, we'll get to this later, when we look at what the development potential is at Job Lot Plaza, that almost doubles the tax revenue from just that site based on our concept plan and that entire area generates now. So it's pretty significant. And it's significant because we're going to talk about tax increment financing, which is taking that additional tax revenue and how do we reinvest that? We can reinvest that in public infrastructure. We might reinvest some of that into property buyouts and some of the restoration work that we're talking about in the Market Street area. Part of the SNEP grant is how do we improve stormwater? Stormwater that comes off the Metacom area flows into the Kickmute River. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a rain event that generated almost 6 inches of rain in a short period of time. The amount of water that sheeted off of the Ocean State Job Lot Plaza overwhelmed the stormwater system in Metacom Avenue that's owned by the state, to the point that it overwent the berm at Water Roller and flooded their manufacturing facility. So again, there are things, all of that stormwater is untreated and all that stormwater is flowing into the Kickmute River. So one of the things we want to do in any future development is make sure that we're incorporating BMPs and best management practices to make sure that we're not having untreated stormwater going into freshwater systems. There are no flood zones in Metacom, obviously. It's one of the higher elevations in town, but when you do get down to those residential neighborhoods to the east along the Kickmute River, they're obviously in the flood zone. But Metacom, the corridor that we're focusing on, is not in a flood zone, but the topography does run downhill from south to north. So it does generate a certain amount of storm water that we want to make sure that we're addressing properly. I will now let Arnold speak.
Not Dr. Diane Moss. So I want to hop in as the project manager for this. Just a quick question to the audience who's here tonight. Who either attended sort of our first or second workshops or saw them online? Put your hands up if you were here. So I figured I had a fairly experienced audience who was in the house. I still want to go over some of these slides to get them on the record for this YouTube, which will go online for folks to watch this. But I am going to go through it rather quickly because you've experienced some of this. But one thing that's very important to recognize is you are one of the few communities that is taking climate data and forecasting that's coming out of the best agencies and applying this locally and thinking about action. So that's a really important point. But one of the keys is we have to get this on the ground to look at what's going to happen in Warren and specifically these project areas. So as part of our project, we applied all the data sets that are available from sort of the well-recognized and peer-tested authorities that are out there. And you can get a sense from the blue and then the yellow shading over time. This is not storm impact. This is merely high tide projections over time for the Market Street area. And so you can see that that low-lying area, you all know, that comes off Belcher Cove and goes under at Redmond Street and then goes behind Twigs. That's really the corridor where that flooding comes back and in. And so we visualize that working with our partners at Union Studio to say, well, what does this look like if you're standing on that streetscape? What do things look like now? So if you've been out there during very high tides, you've seen that you will get sunny day flooding when the water is backing right up through the storm drains. But by 2050, with the forecast for sea level rise, that's the daily high tide right there coming over Market Street. So this is not something that is abstract or very distant in the future. And as time goes on, given those current forecasts, this is that rise that you're looking at the heart of our project area that's taking place. So one of the things that Bob mentioned was that you got this great example of what recently happened. Now, importantly, this is not sea level rise flooding we're talking about from this event we had after Ida. This is fresh water flow generally moving from the south to the north through the watershed. So that is Child Street right at Redmond. It's kind of a picture into the future. So the other factor that we have to build into our planning here is coastal storms on top of sea level rise. And so you can see the Market Street area on the left, very prone to those flood events. And you can see contrasted against on the right-hand side what Metacom looks like. As we mentioned, topography is your friend there and gives you a large area to land redevelopment in as you think about long-term planning. One thing that came up as part of this project that was not initially a focus for us, but it really came up in the second workshop that you all brought up, was the transportation system, regionally thinking about this. So certainly there are impacts locally to Warren and what will happen to your roadways. These are excerpts from a study done by Rhode Island statewide planning that identified assets that were subject to threat. It looked at things town by town, and that was very valuable in doing a first blush assessment of what's endangered out there. And so those were terrifically useful to look at. There's sea level rise on the left, and there is storm surge on the right. And so you really are at the center of some of those road networks where they all meet and where they all have to cross to keep things open. Flood insurance maps tell us also the story, but this is current flood mapping, not building in necessarily sea level rise modeling. But again, all of that area within the Market Street area, very threatened by flood. Won't talk too much about federal flood insurance program, except it's a background thing to pay attention to because it's a policy that underpins your risk and how you manage risk. And I think there's going to be a lot of movement in Congress in the coming years as to how much Congress is willing to pay for flood insurance and underwrite the program, which will, as we see more sea level rise threats, will have a very big effect on can banks write mortgages? Can insurance companies write policies on buildings in these project areas? So it's not something that you control directly, but it's an important factor in planning for these low-lying areas. So the real heart of this is we have taken what we presented to you at our July meeting, which were a series of sort of objectively presented, you can go this direction or you can go this direction. We got great feedback both through the website, through project emails, through folks who attended the sessions on where to go. And so we have got recommendations to make, but I do want to walk you through those scenario pieces. Again, one important proviso to give you is that this is concept level planning. This is not on the ground construction plans that you're ready to implement. This is looking at order of magnitude. So what is forecast? What's the quantification of these impacts? Using the data and being sort of pessimistically conservative and giving you scenarios that you can look at. And our methodology comes from a lot of terrific sources and a lot of partners who've worked with us on this. And again, it's important that this has all been tested, been looked at, and is accepted. So we're going to give you the no action scenario, and which is not recommended, and the phased relocation and restoration scenario for Market Street, which we recommend move to the next phase of really getting into study and figuring out how you do it. So if you do nothing, and we go by those sea level rise impacts that I showed you, based on the timing from the NOAA forecasts, and we look at those same flooding overviews that we've mapped out for you. In 2035, from that just regular high tide flooding, in our project area, quantifying it, you've got 58 properties that are flooded. That's 31 buildings, 57 housing units, and 86 residents. And we've quantified lost tax revenue and quantified your building loss costs based on their valuations within your tax structure, assessed structure. 2050, we follow that out. And you can see that the impact by just 2050 is potentially 121 housing units that are lost, a significant number for a town Warren's size. And I think one of the things that's really striking is residents displaced. As we've talked about Warren as a tight-knit community where you don't want to see people who are displaced by this. You want to plan for this actively as you move forward. And building loss cost of those buildings within that impact zone and your lost annual revenue. One thing that the town has been really good about is saying, focus on 2035, focus on 2050. Certainly 2070 and 2100 are out there, but look at what's in your immediate future and plan for those things. The one thing we did look at, though, was in 2035, what happens if you get that 100-year storm effect at the flooding levels forecast by the models, and what are those impacts? And so this is with just a little bit of sea level rise by 2035, it magnifies the impact of that 100-year storm. And we saw that with Child Street, what happens with that impact. So modeled that out for 2050 as well. And so it really speaks to preparing and not going through a no action scenario where those costs are borne by insurance or by folks potentially walking away from their buildings if they're damaged. You will potentially lose commercial buildings and displace businesses, which will lose operational days. That impacts your employment. And one of the factors that we've quantified for our final report as well is environmental pollution and cleanup costs. There are not only businesses that have storage in those facilities, but every house that has an oil tank, everybody who's got stored things at home, those are all factors in sort of risk within the project area. And then the more immediate pieces, municipal financial impacts of lost tax revenue, and then replacement of town-owned infrastructure that might be in the project zones. So we've totaled that all out. This will all be in the final report. I don't want you to be terrified by that number. There's lots of factors that go into that of what will sea level rise be as we track it. And also the very longer term, you want to always do planning in phases. It's not an all, you're going to do this all next year and have to be done with it, but you have to start somewhere in your scenarios. So I want to talk about roadway impacts a little bit because that's an immediate concern. This is some of that flooding that's already occurred. This is not related to Ida. This is prior to that, about when those are impacted. And you're going to see a lot more road damage and infrastructure damage to the point where these could become impassable in terrible condition. But Child Street by 2050 will be flooded. And 136 at Belcher Cove, that low-lying bridge is out there for 2050. Most important to us is thinking about impassable roads during storm events and your evacuation routes. We're going to touch on that in just a second. And non-functioning stormwater systems as they go further under, and accelerated roadway deterioration and your repair costs that you have to bear on those things. So we're trying as much as possible to give you an apples to apples comparison. If you do nothing, here's the impacts, and they are measurable. And if you pursue a path where there's change, here's what happens. So roadway impacts, this is a very important slide to take a quick look at. Those dashed lines are your evacuation routes that are mapped. And certainly within our project area, we've got 136 moving north and south, and we've got 103 moving east-west. They thankfully head to high ground once you get south of our project area and downtown. And of course, you're also going to want to be thinking about the access on the part of North Main Street, where it heads towards the bridge to Barrington. But for our project area, we've got two very important road segments that are there. We did map out emergency services impacts since our last meeting. That was critical, just locally to look at where things are and what's affected. And you're right in the heart of it with all those pieces about thinking of those connections. So our recommendation is obviously not the no action scenario. It's to really be thinking about a phased approach for relocation of endangered assets and buildings that are in the low-lying areas, and thinking about beginning to think restoring some of that land to give you buffers, living shorelines, and flood storage potentially. So it's 4 phases over 50 to 70 years. There are buyouts of properties that are in danger of repetitive flooding and storm damage, beginning to think about that planning now. Where you can no longer service properties, removal of local streets, and rerouting or removal of utilities where they're going to be lost or endangered by that change. And then restoration of wetlands for protective buffering and flood storage, especially along Belcher Cove, and adaptation of state roadways. So phase 1 has been mapped out to sort of show those same things we measured for the no action scenario. What are the costs if you do a phased relocation and sort of managed retreat process through there? And you'll see it's really everything that is over to the northwest side of Market Street as it passes just to the upper left of phase 1 up there. The Jamie Hill Park landfill zone, which is very low lying. And some adaptation down below Market Street as it heads towards Child, the extreme low-lying area. I also do want to note, we don't think of it as part of this corridor, but if you proceed directly up 136 and you don't take the left like you're heading up towards Route 6, but you instead stay on the historic Metacom Avenue, you'll see that neighborhood in the upper right, which is right on the marsh. And that is another area that's going to be in a very low-lying condition. So phase 2, this is something to achieve between 2035 and 2050, given the forecasts for what sea level rise will bring, is beginning to move down some of those side streets. And again, thinking about phased buyout, relocation, and beginning to think about how your regional transportation system works. That's when 103 becomes endangered as an east-west movement. And that we've carried out those phases again in the very long term, sort of 2050 to 2070, based on the current forecasts. One discussion we have had is the potential of thinking about, can 103, if it's adapted for being a resilient east-west roadway, also function as a form of flood control to protect things to the south. That's something you definitely we're recommending exploring in the next phase. And then phase 4, playing this out to 2100 in the extents that are currently modeled, is a very large area because this is very low lying. But we have modeled that out to give a sense of impact of what that means to do a managed retreat from there and do adaptation through that zone. So that's the overall summary. This will be in our final report. Again, this is a very long-term 80-year forecasting, but better to know where you're starting from and what your benchmarks are, and have the discussions about how those first phases can take place. This does allow you to essentially put back some environmental conditions that historically existed in this area. This was a low-lying wetland buffer area that was built upon. You have a chance to improve stormwater quality and to proactively mitigate existing environmental pollution sources that are in the project areas, rather than a storm event having an impact on those. There's lots of great precedents out there for y'all to follow that are going on within the state, that are going on nationally. There are many of these projects in areas that get repetitive flooding, where there are more folks who want to sort of control where they're heading, sell their property, move within the same community, move to where they want to go. Then often there's funding available to do. So starting that planning well ahead of time, it does take time to line that up. One factor, because this is a stormwater study, is there's a fair amount of impervious surface in this area, which is contributing to stormwater quality issues in Belcher Cove. So we've quantified that and quantified the stormwater impacts that would take place as well. And then begun to envision that if, by sort of a period of, say, 2070, partway through this, if that sort of managed buyout and flood restoration were to take place, what might that look like? How do you keep transportation corridors intact? How do you build buffer and flood storage areas that go through those zones? And then how do you sort of handle a managed retreat while creating a public asset at the same time? So it protects, but also provides an asset for the community. So other communities that have done this, Austin, Texas did a very aggressive project that was like this, basically created marsh parkland, which is fully accessible. It's not just a sort of, you look at it, but it's a landscape you can still move through in a relative way. For state roadways, for this piece of it, protecting transportation connections, this shows you regionally where those connections are. We're going to zoom right in and talk about the cutoffs from getting to the airport, getting to your hospitals, getting from your fire and ambulance equipment and police equipment, moving across. So those evacuation routes are dashed. We very much talk about how do you make this happen? Well, you've got to partner with RIDOT. And so Bob's been taking the lead on that, so he can give you an update on where that is.
So as we've gotten into this process, I mean, we also identified that RIDOT had Market Street in the 2022-23 tip for repaving. And we said that really didn't make a lot of sense just to repave a road that we know is going to be underwater. So we've entered into a pilot program with RIDOT in the last month, where we are going to be working with them and their consulting engineers on developing a road adaptation strategy. Surprisingly enough, in New England, there are no road adaptation strategies anywhere. We do identify, statewide planning identified roads in Rhode Island that were vulnerable to sea level rise. When you do your TIP application, there's a box that you check, is this road vulnerable to sea level rise? But there is no active strategies to address it. And more alarmingly, just looking across the United States, there's a lack of road adaptation strategies. There are some things that you see in Louisiana, there's some things you see down in the Florida Keys, but there really isn't anything nationally. So I think we're very fortunate that we have this opportunity. RIDOT had some money left from a previous grant. We've got about $90,000 to start this, but we're going to leverage that funding to look at other funding to see what our strategies for road adaptation can be, because as we've seen, Market Street will be underwater in 14 years. Child Street will be partially underwater in 14 years. So as Arnold alluded to, is before we get to phase 3 and phase 4, is there something we can do with Child Street that makes phase 3 and phase 4 not necessary? There will be some pain associated with this, but doing nothing is going to have pain as well. So what we're doing right now is, in fact, I just finished it today. I'll submit it tomorrow. So there are a number of programs available. So through FEMA, there's the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities. I'm submitting tomorrow notice of intent that we're going to be filing an application for some additional funding to continue to look at this. When we look at the area that we're talking about, Market Street, that's in Census Tract 305. That's a low moderate income community. There are a large percentage of residents in that community that don't have vehicles. So their need for public transportation is important. The fact that we can't get to emergency shelters because these roads potentially can be underwater. So there's a whole host of criteria that go into the PRIC application that, beyond just what we're going to see in 2035, that give us a lot of points in terms of being eligible for some of this funding. And the whole purpose of this is not to scare people. The whole purposes of this is to just be honest with people and educate them, because if we don't do anything, we are going to be caught with literally our pants down. That's not going to be a good situation. In our conversations recently with both Senator Whitehouse and Senator Reed, Army Corps of Engineers has funding for property buyouts and resiliency. USDA has funding for those types of projects. We want to be able to work with the Infrastructure Bank. I'm happy to see Sean our work here from the Infrastructure Bank. We think that we can cobble all of these projects or these funding sources together in addition to monies that the town can contribute through tax increment financing, that we have skin in the game to say, how can we collectively address this situation? And coming up with a strategy for property buyouts is very critical, because in the past, these communities that have in Warwick and Cranston, it hasn't been an exact science in terms of how that buyout program has worked. So we need to, have a strategy, but also have a legal strategy that if property owners do not want to participate, what legal rights do we have under eminent domain as a result of public safety to take these properties at a fair market value? Again, not to scare people, but these are realities that we know are going to happen in the next 14 years. And as a community, we have a fiduciary responsibility to be honest and talk about these things. And again, we only have to look back to 2 weeks ago to see what the impact of a rainstorm with over 5 inches of rain in 2 hours. We had 2 homes that were condemned as a result of flooding, because of that event. Every prediction is these types of events are going to increase. They're not going to decrease.
I just want to take a minute. This is a mistake in the sense that this is last year's flyer for the BRIC program, and BRIC this year is capitalized at $1 billion. So it's doubled. And I think one of the things we're seeing as we're seeing things come out of the federal government is that there's more and more funding being allocated to climate change adaptation. So communities that are thinking the way you're thinking and are pre-positioning themselves with responses are the ones that are going to have an advantage in competing for those dollars. So that's an important piece to emphasize.
No, I think I've talked, I guess the last piece I would say on this is that, that it's kind of in flux right now, what's in the infrastructure bill. There's the Senate version, there's potentially the House version, whatever that compromise is going to be. In our conversations with Senator Whitehouse, there's a big piece of resiliency. Those projects that are more shovel ready and ready to go are going to be teed up prior to others. I think the direction we're going with this, and we're not at the implementation stage, there's still more planning and analysis that needs to be done. But I think, as Arnold said, we feel like we're way ahead of any other community in Rhode Island in terms of taking a holistic approach of this, because, it's not just the Market Street area, as we'll talk about in a minute. We displace people in Market Street. We don't want those people to leave Warren. We want to find another place for them to live. And are there opportunities for us to improve Warren by the redevelopment of the Metacom corridor? And that's, the other part that we're looking at. But, I've had people, different consulting engineers that worked with the state say, are you afraid that you're scaring people by having this conversation? And our intent is not to scare them. Our intent is to educate them, because there will become a time, and a frustration that I've expressed often is that every time we have these conversations, the two groups that aren't at the table are the lenders and the insurance companies. And at some point, the repetitive loss is going to be worse than the absolute loss. That insurance premiums are either going to go up, or insurance companies are not going to insure these properties. Consequently, lenders won't finance these properties. And that's going to be a crisis. We saw that in one of the properties that we just recently had condemned. The owners basically said, here's the keys. I don't have insurance. See you later, bye. So now we're, potentially stuck with the demolition costs, the environmental cleanup costs. And, if somebody's telling you that, they're basically judgment proof. So, that's not a scenario we want to be in, but that's a real potential scenario that communities are going to be facing. And that's not just Warren, it's any low-lying community in the state of Rhode Island. Now we'll talk about the good news. Redevelopment of the Metacom Avenue corridor.
You want to touch on that? Oh, okay.
Yep, so I'll just start off. So every time I drove down Metacom Avenue, I just scratched my head and said, how did this happen? And again, as I said, that's what typical planning was in the 50s and 60s. There was no planning. And so, there's things that can happen in the short term. The town council has given us the support to look at introducing zone changes that will increase density. We're working on adopting form-based code, as I said. We're working with consultants to put a structure in place to do tax increment financing. So these are all things that the town can control its destiny, but we're also engaging DOT in terms of conversations about how can we improve public transportation? How can we improve what the design of Metacom looks like? Incorporating better stormwater management and improving utilities in this area. That's a combination of local, state, and federal funds, but we are well on the path to getting that process started. As we're updating, our comprehensive plan, we're making our comprehensive plan more of a corridor plan that it's very centric to what happens on Metacom, because everything that happens on Metacom will have an impact on other areas of the community. So what we've done, and Paul speak to this more, is we've looked at where do we have potential development sites. So the first one that jumped out to me was the Ocean State Job Lot site. Again, it's park in the front, 8 acres of parking. We are in conversations with, it's kind of a convoluted ownership situation. You have a fee owner, then you have a leasehold owner. It used to be a supermarket. Royal Hold has that ground lease. We're not exactly sure how much longer they have, but so we're talking to them about the development potential. But we've also identified some other parcels where there are opportunities to do development. And what we're looking at is, mixed use development, creating village centers, centers that respect the residential communities on either side of Metacom, that can be a resource for people to walk to have services, but also to create housing, both for people that might be displaced from Market Street, but to create more workforce housing as well. And that a large part of that will be improving public transportation along that corridor, whether people are commuting, to Newport because of the blue technology that's emerging there, or people that want to reside in Warren and want to commute from the new train station and Fall River to Boston, if people ever do go back to Boston. We're trying to take advantage of all those opportunities, but creating additional density there takes development pressure off our historic downtown area. It lets us preserve those historic features. And then when we look to the eastern part of town, the Twisted area in the northeast section of town, we have a lot of areas for development, but we don't have infrastructure there. We don't have public water, we don't have public sewer. So we want to preserve those assets as well. So this area really lends itself to redevelopment and increased density that will really have a transformative effect on the community.
Great. So looking at this is the overall concept plan for Metacom Avenue. And as Bob mentioned, we were tasked with looking at a variety of properties of different sizes, different scales, and sort of organize them into these 6 blocks. We'll go into a little bit more in depth. But as you can see, besides the Ocean State Job Lot site, which is unique in its size, we've tried to focus all the density and the mixed use along Metacom Avenue, and with the reconfigured streetscape that's Bob and Arnold have both touched on. I think they'll show a street section later on. You can start to imagine that this corridor will now become a lot more defined and much more walkable, bike friendly and bus friendly area. And so we can see too, because our focus was to really also think about what kind of yields could we get out of this? What could be the potential for Warren, and looking at relocating, if you have to relocate businesses to this area and residents to this area at a very high concept level, what could fit there? And so we've sort of got these totals of about 520 units we're estimating, commercial space of about 107,500 square feet. So about 452 multifamily units. And so the first site that we looked at much more in depth than the other sites was the Ocean State Job Lot site. And really we were tasked by the town to think about this as a neighborhood center. And so we've kept the main entrances off of Metacom. We've tried to reduce curb cuts. We've left the existing Lauren's restaurant, the existing auto body on the corner, and we've infilled with smaller multifamily mixed use buildings up along Metacom, which could also be maybe there's live work units. Those could be much more different unit types than you would typically see. And as you come down the main entry, which is now a nice boulevard that brings you into the development, which is surrounded by mixed-use buildings, residential buildings, you have a nice common area, common green, with possibly a performing arts center as the backdrop. I think there's potential, or you could.
You're from Roger Williams University, please take note.
So that's where we've envisioned that it'll be a nice backdrop to that that green space there. And as you continue down the greenway, then you transition into sort of your higher density townhome development with a nice green along Vernon. Then if we go to the next slide, you can see that this is sort of a vision of what that might look like. And having those walkable streets, having parking that's tucked behind buildings, having street parking that makes it really feel like more of a town center.
I'd just add that this site has the ability for the most density because you have a natural buffer to the west behind this property. It doesn't transition immediately to a residential neighborhood. You have the National Grid kind of greenway behind there. So this is an area that, potentially for housing, we would offer a density bonus to a developer that wanted to do more workforce housing. So if the form-based code said 3 or 4 stories, potentially we might allow 5 stories because it's not going to have a direct impact on, an immediate residential neighborhood abutting it. When we get to the east side of Metacom, the transition from commercial to the residential neighborhood is much faster. So we want to respect the scale of building heights on that side, probably not anything more than 2 or 3 stories because they abut directly to a residential neighborhood.
So here's Ocean State Job Lot again as Block D, showing this the land uses that I discussed in the previous slide. And then Block C is the lots neighboring that. There's a CVS there currently. So with this lot, we imagine this is a little bit of a different scenario. There's 4 property owners here. So we've imagined that as if this could be developed as a cohesive development, but each within the own, staying within the property owners. And so again, we've got the 3 stories, mixed use buildings and a multifamily building along Metacom, trying to reduce those curb cuts. We still have, a few because you have the different property owners, but they can share parking access. So with the new form-based code, things like this would be encouraged where you can have shared access between the lots, between that and also Ocean State Job Lot. And then as you go further back down Seymour Street, we can transition this into a little townhome, single family attached development around a common green that transitions, very nicely into the neighborhood beyond. And so with blocks E and F, these are much smaller, and as Bob mentioned, the transition is really quick to the neighboring lots in the back. So we've tried to keep that all the mixed use up on the front with 2 to 5 story buildings, and then you have townhomes or maybe your walk-up apartment multifamilies, which you're seeing on the corners that transition to the residential units. And here, these were really nicely shaped blocks that allowed us to have all the parking behind with still managing to focus on public amenity too. Even though these lots are smaller, you can think of having smaller pocket parks, smaller plazas, pedestrian passages with little spots that can transition into the parking areas. And then lastly, with block A and B, we have 2 pretty varied sides here. So block B is nice and small. So we've kept very simply held the street there. And what's nice about this lot is that it's a little different than the others. So we don't actually have to have any curb cuts on Metacom Ave at all. So keep that pedestrian edge. And then with block A, it's having such a deep lot, we can transition the types of residential units and uses that go back and kind of be a friendly neighbor to those single family housing units that are behind. And so with this lot, we've got about, 86 units in block A and 20 units in block B. And block A is including 18 units of this new development that has already been approved in gray. And so just to give some sort of background and ideas and precedents of redevelopment corridors that have already happened before, this is perhaps a lot of people are very familiar with South County Commons. which is, we got mixed use with offices above, scale of about 2 to 2.5 stories, with a nice public amenity at the end of their main street where lots of events can happen, farmers markets. So these have become really vital areas for the community, which you can imagine, like, you know, someplace like Ocean State Java and all of the Metacom corridor becoming. And here's more examples of scales of about 2 to 5 stories, where you have different scales of mixed use of redevelopment. We have different types of hardscape, or both softscape and hardscape public spaces, and also looking at how, you know, you might handle in such on Metacom Avenue bus and bike traffic and pedestrian traffic, and how that might work. This floating bus island on top, right? And then these are all focused on multifamily and different types of multifamily buildings that you could see in the area, from townhouses to smaller scale to mid-scale multifamilies of up to 3 stories. And I think, you know, what we wanted to show here is just the articulation of the buildings and the quality of the buildings and the character that you can have. So that's something that I think will be important to have into the zoning, which Bob is working hard on. So
One note I just want to add, this is from the phase 2 report, but we're working with a real estate consultant and talking about the future value impact, and the market has changed since we started the project last October. But one of the things we want to be looking at is sort of long-term value, and because one of the things that is predict what future value of these investment ability is those build out scenarios for how things go. So because we're mapping, you know, your tax incremental financing on that, so the fact that we have that working with a consultant on that, the fact that we're looking at more data sets that will allow us to give you some pretty good modeling that can carry you to the next phase. What is the upside of Metacom Avenue redevelopment? What can that yield you for sort of fuel for redevelopment, for tax incremental financing, and also for retreat out of this area? I did want to note that Bob had talked about current configuration of Metacom Avenue, which is the only 4-lane section in between these 2 other 2-lane sections, 3-lane sections, turning lane. And that is something that's come up, that lower figure on that right-hand side, you know, really improving that for all different user types, and the national data on this kind of conversion, which can be done very affordably, by the way, through some paint signage and re-signalization, is that roadway functionality in terms of its rating does not change and becomes a safer roadway. But volume still stays the same. So the one thing I do want to add, because this is a SNP grant, is stormwater retrofits. That gray shading shows you how much the Metacom Avenue is impervious and paved, 76%. So it's a huge generator of stormwater, which is going right, most of it untreated into the Kickamuit. And so there's a real opportunity to change your environmental quality for the Kickamuit River here with this project. So there's that mapping that we've done that sort of shows how that goes. And these are being done all over the place. That's a typical treatment for a parking lot with a rain garden between rows of parking. And there's a chance to do it with roadways, which DOT, by the way, is implementing across the state as part of its best practices for linear stormwater treatment. So there are terrific sort of, you know, assets that you can use to begin to do this. And I wanted to end with just this image. If you didn't see it, this is the corner of the job lot parking lot where all the water came off of it after Hurricane Ida. And you can see the brown in there. That was all placed granite stone. So much water came off the corner of that parking lot that it basically brought down all of the stone into Vernon Street and washed out that corner. So a lot of it came down the staircase and avoided it, but the overflow took out the stone. That's what we're going to keep seeing more and more in this zone unless we start treating stormwater and thinking about attenuating the flow. Yeah, this is after the town had actually pushed it with their loader. They pushed a bunch of the stone out of the roadway. Yep. So next steps.
I think I just want to go back to, you know, when we talk about South County Commons and the Mashpee project, those are great examples of what we think a neighborhood or village center could be. But unlike these locations, there's no residential neighborhoods immediately abutting those projects. The difference here is that these are, you know, redevelopment of Metacom are projects that people could walk to from surrounding neighborhoods. I think that's a very important point in terms of what the potential success and attractiveness of what these projects can be.
So our next steps, at least from the team perspective, is the recording from tonight's workshop will be shared on YouTube on the project channel. Will be shared to the website. Our final report, which documents our process and all these outcomes and recommendations, which will include videos town, will be done in December to act as a base for action. You're already working with RIDOT on roadway adaptation studies and designs. And what we tend to find for projects like this is that when you come up with a concept for a direction that you can move in for adaptation. Make sure I'm on for YouTube. That what this report can serve as the base for your next funding applications for where you want to go. And you're heading now into a much more specific design world where if you're heading in an adaptation direction, now you begin to design those roadways for the adaptation of 103. You begin to adopt all of your tools to get ready for Metacom to absorb everything. And the thing that always amazes me is that, Bob's the one-man planning department. And so this is an effort that's going to take sort of an expanded, effort from a lot of folks in town to be part of. It's not all on one person, but you're well positioned to move forward. And I'll say editorially, more than many Southern New England communities are to move forward. So that's it for me.
This is your opportunity to offer comments, criticisms, questions. Right? Not necessarily. Yeah, so I mean, I think the process is that we've discussed with the council about doing the zoning map amendment and the zoning ordinance amendment. We need to have the comprehensive plan updated in order to incorporate those. As part of the zoning amendment, it'd be the form-based code. So we're in, hopefully by this time next year, we will have the comp plan completed and the zone changes will be moving forward. The planning board has endorsed identifying this area as a special revitalization district for purposes of the tax increment financing. So yeah, to give a timeline, both the fee owner, and if a fee owner has a ground lease for another 25 years, then they're interested in what the development potential is because they control that. The property owner also has an opportunity if he sees the development potential to buy that ground lease out. So both of those parties are very interested, but the zone change has to happen first. So, if we are looking, the next year is continuing to plan, continuing to look at funding sources for Market Street. Procedurally, we'll continue to work on the zone changes and all the things that have to happen on Metacom. Then I think we're going to start to see some activity. This is not, we're going to be done in 5 years. This is, the next year is planning and changes. I think then years 2 through 5, you're going to start to see some activity in the real estate market, and you're probably going to start to see some development. But this is also taking a look at what 10 and 15, 20 years looks like as well. I think once one domino falls, the rest will begin to fall, but the zone change has to happen first. Yeah, I know, and I can give Grant a microphone.
So that person probably heard the response, but not the question.
need to have Brandon say that again or just moving forward? Okay. Does anybody else have any comments, questions? Anybody here live in
Okay, my name's Jesse. I live here on Child Street. And I heard a lot in the beginning about that we don't want the people to leave the town. And you know, we could afford to lose some buildings. The buildings aren't the town, the people make up the town. And I want to know, because the area that we're looking at is exclusively in the economic opportunity zone. So this is a group of people who are below a certain percentage of the average income for Rhode Island. And what I want to know is that these people who own the homes, live in them, or even rent in them, it seems like you guys want them to move to Metacom, but I'm just having a lot of trouble wrapping my brain around the whole concept. Timeliness of one, got to build before they can move there. Two, it seems with rent prices, rents are more than mortgages in many cases, and if the average income is below, say, 80% of the average of the state, and then the rest of the town, I won't say that we're all wealthy, but I would think that a brand new house would cost a lot more than one that's 100 years old. So what kind of assurances do we have that if this is truly what we want these people to move from the homes to these mixed use program that we're looking at, what kind of assurance do we have? Because don't get me wrong, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong. Workforce housing is basically like Section 8, right?
No.
It's like low income.
No.
It's below a certain income. What
No.
is
So workforce housing is housing that teachers and first responders can afford. It's not a federal or state program. It's rents that, we want to attract somebody that's going to be a first year police officer. Can they live in this community? Can they afford to live in this community? So they,
right. So what is the not cut you off, what is the qualification?
But we haven't, I have a criticism in terms of how Rhode Island housing determines what is affordable, because we're lumped into a geographical economic district that includes Barrington, which skews kind of the affordability number based on income. But so, what we didn't get into, because it's not necessarily part of this, but to address your question, one of the things that we've looked at in terms of what tax increment financing could do. Can we put some of that money into an affordable housing trust fund, which we have the framework for? One of the things we're looking for is out of the American Rescue program, is there funding we could put into an affordable housing trust fund to make sure that, there is affordable housing for people that are displaced. The other thing we're doing in terms of form-based code, and when we offer a density bonus, that's to have committed units for workforce housing, whatever we determine that affordability to be. But if a developer did not want to take advantage of that density bonus, or he didn't want to commit to providing those to be workforce housing, we're going to require that they make a financial contribution to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And this is something that when I worked down in Virginia that we did quite often, it was very successful. So, the town is going to be very, I don't want to say progressive, but very out in front in terms of, we are going to make sure that we provide housing for people that can afford to live and stay here. Because again, if you look at 80% of area median income now, which is what Rhode Island housing considers to be affordable, is a house over $300,000, which is crazy.
I agree. So I guess
That's a state issue that, we're trying to address on a policy level is, let's not put us in, and this is not a criticism of every other community, but are those numbers real in terms of what's considered affordable?
right. So I guess the heart of the question is that we're going to ask these people to move for the good of the city, to give everybody else a buffer.
Well, for their own good too.
And of course, for their own good. But what, if any, studies have we done to see if these people will really actually be able to stay in more? because like I said in the beginning, or afford to, because like I said in the beginning, we can afford to lose houses. Houses don't make a town. People make the town. Lose our neighbors, to lose our friends, our coworkers, our family, and for them to be basically just shut out economically. I just want to know how we looked at that and what kind of answers we have for that.
I don't think we've done a deep dive on that yet. I mean, I think, I'm definitely aware of it because I deal with it on a daily basis. But I think COVID has really skewed the real estate market in the last 18 months. And there's some kind of resettling of that. I mean, I just was looking at some statistics today in many communities, property value, resale values or list prices have dropped from August to September in some communities by almost 18 to 20%. So I think you're starting to see some leveling of what values are. But as we go through this process, and inflation will continue to happen, and other costs will incur. I mean, that's something we're going to be vigilant on. But we're way too early to say today that we know what that number needs to be if we're talking 5 years out. But I think as a community and as a strategy, we can continue to reinforce that workforce housing. Section 8 is a federal program, and that has a life all of its own. What we're talking about is people that don't qualify for Section 8, but somebody that is a single mom, that is a teacher in the elementary school that might have 2 kids. They typically should qualify, in many cases, they would qualify for some kind of subsidized housing. We don't necessarily always want to call it subsidized. We just want them to have safe, decent, affordable housing. And that's kind of, what the hallmark of that is.
Right.
Long answer to your short question.
Yeah. Sorry to hog the mic. If anybody else has a question, I did have a follow-up if anybody wants to speak. Okay, so I would just like to know, what qualifies subsidized housing. Where is the subsidy or workforce housing? Where is the average person who's going to be losing their home? Where do they fit in the mix? Are they making too much? Because I know that the brand new apartments are going to be more than the mortgage. Absolutely 100%. I don't even have to see the numbers. I already know because I'm a landlord here in Rhode Island, and I have a 107-year-old house, and I charge almost more than most people for a small, 1-bedroom home. So.
Yeah, I don't think we have those hard numbers yet. But I think we have our eye on the ball for that. I think that, again, the council had endorsed redoing the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and we're looking at ways to fund that. There will be some, income limits associated with that. But again, that's a moving target as we go forward. But it's definitely a priority for this plan. And to your point, a concern that we have is the majority of the population in this impacted area. There's a pretty, I would say majority, very strong high percentage that are renters. There's a strong, almost 30% of the property owners in that area either don't live in Warren or don't live in the state. So, those are, properties that we think, people might just walk from. So but I don't have a concrete answer.
Right.
Right. And like I said, I'm not really looking for to just have a catch-all for everybody. Let's do as much for as many people as we can.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
Yeah. And just you're a great. This is a question that the Fuss and O'Neill team has talked about a lot because we're looking at sort of nationally what's happening with buyout programs, and they're run in many different ways in different communities, and some have worked really well and some have been unsuccessful. And part of our recommendations is to give you some of those models that Warren can learn from those processes that have gone on, and not to put them on the spot, but John and Teresa, I'd love to hear what you've also seen in the research. But I brought up the slide for a particular reason. So this is the sort of if sea level rise happens the way we're thinking it's going to happen by 2035, the number of housing units is 57, right? It's 31 buildings. So the good news is there's 14 years to affect that change for those 57 housing units. Now that's a lot to do, but you've got to know where to start to make that happen. So one of the things I haven't seen that the model is people from this zone would transfer to Metacom Avenue. The best buyout programs that I've studied and looked at have been ones where the government agency or agencies, the partnerships that have come together to go to people and say, if you're interested in selling your property because you're going to be looking at more flooding in the future, we'll take your property at its market value and purchase it from you. And then you can take those dollars and go wherever you want. If you want to build an accessory dwelling unit because you're older behind your kid's house, great, you can do that. If you want to move to Florida, you can do that. Or if you want to buy another house in this community, you can do that. Or if you want to live on Metacombination Avenue, you can do that. So to provide flexibility to those folks who are participating in a buyout program, I see as one of the best models. That's a personal view. And Warren doesn't have to do it that way. So I think there's two factors on your side. You can, to a certain extent, depending on who your funding comes from, craft it to fit what the community needs it to do as much as you can. The other thing is time on your side. It's not like you're facing all 400 units next year that have to get moved. So you can phase this in as you go. But it's time to start thinking about that and having those discussions and hopefully using those models that are out there. So I don't know if anyone else has sort of seen good models, Teresa or Sean, for great buyout programs. Now, you don't have to. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, we had a series
Teresa,
of.
just let everyone know who
Oh,
you
hi,
are.
hi, everybody. I'm Teresa Crane. I'm a coastal community planner from the University of Rhode Island. And working with Sean O'Rourke, our Chief Resiliency Officer at the Infrastructure Bank, and some others across the state, we did convene a series of discussions about a buyout programs that we've learned from across the country and what has worked and what hasn't worked here in the state of Rhode Island. And one of the model communities that we did hear from was Charlotte-Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. It's a big community. It's a big urban area. So it's a different scale than we have here. But one of the things that it came down to in the discussion was the funding mechanism. And they use a stormwater utility or a stormwater fee to fund their buyout program. So I think creative financing for these programs to support and subsidize the relocation, the fair market value to the owners, and also support to the renters who may not have the same support to relocate from the sending area, which is the area you're moving out of, to the receiving area or to other opportunities for housing in town, is a critical component of this when we start planning, get the zoning change in place, and in that time that it takes to do that, figure out the mechanics of the capacity and where people could go and the finance mechanisms as part of that whole program. So we have other examples from Texas and Florida for buyout programs as well. But the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County example was one that resonated with me. I think, Bob, you also mentioned Iowa had Cedar Rapids, had a good example to draw from. So it's not just coastal. There are also inland communities that have riverine system impacts that also are really ripe for us to learn from. Thank you.
Paul said he saw another hand.
Jim Patterson, I'm on the planning board for the town. Bob. One of the questions, and I think this was touched on in one of the two earlier sessions we had, talk about seawater rise and what it does to the existing thoroughfares that are in the affected area. And one of the things that needs to be done, I believe, is the removal of existing infrastructure like storm sewers, sanitary sewers, gas and electricity, if they're subgrade. My question is, and I don't know that I've seen it in the figures that have been put up, but has sort of a two-part question. Where do you relocate them to? Number one. And two, has the cost of relocation and installation been figured into those costs?
So they were presented at the second workshop. You're right. That is where you saw them. They will be in the final report and we have calculated them. So I will say we've calculated removal based on industry standard costs right now, depending on depth and then length, obviously, because that affects the cost. and then size of each of those services in terms of pipe size. And we have also factored in typical costs for installation new. The one thing we won't do as part of this project is try to figure out the routing for the new systems. There's just too many variables to do that. So we're applying a general sort of distance multiplier. We'll have that very upfront in our methodology explanation. But we do want to, the job of this project is to get you in the room with the ballpark costs. So yes, removal and then installation of new have been given what we call an order of magnitude estimate.
Another thing I'll add to that is that when we had the last workshop, I complained incessantly how DOT wasn't at the table. That worked because DOT is at the table now. I've complained incessantly how National Grid isn't at the table because we have no idea, where their infrastructure is on Market Street, as an example. We know there's gas underneath, and we have both a gas distribution and electric substation in this impacted area. When Senator Reed was here 3 weeks ago, I voiced that frustration, and he said we will get National Grid to the table. So I will continue to make complaints, and hopefully we'll continue to make progress. But that's a missing piece to your question, Jim. And we need to know what they have before we can know what the impacts are going to be. But there's no logical reason why a utility wouldn't want to partner with the municipality or the state to solve this problem. We actually got an explanation from DOT that National Grid told them it was a national security issue, that they couldn't share this information, quote unquote.
My question will fit perfectly in with Jim's, because in this morning's Projo, probably been going on for a while, but the potential sale of Narragansett Electric, or the sale of the utilities, and in relation to the East Bay Bike Path bridges, the $12 million price tag attached to moving those utilities, and now they're going to sell. And how do we prepare for that? That's not a question. Is there, yeah, I was just kind of like, throw another wrench into it.
Well, I mean, and again, I think, hopefully because Pittsburgh Electric and Gas, I think that's the company that's purchasing, the assets for National Grid, will want to be a better player than National Grid has been. But, I think, people are throwing these numbers around, and we don't know how real these numbers are, whether it's the bridge replacement or the utility relocation. But, with respect to the bridge, I mean, I asked this question of the director several months ago. What if he didn't replace the bridge? Who's going to pay for it? Is National Grid still going to have to pay for that? So why wouldn't they want to share the cost if you were going to replace the bridges? But it's very difficult, not even because of this project, but anything that we do as a municipality and other municipalities, that you don't have a partner with your utility company to share what information they have. I've never seen anything like it before, but it is kind of, and everyone just says, well, that's because it's National Grid. Well, that's not an acceptable answer. I mean, that's a leadership issue. I mean, it's certainly above my pay grade, but I mean, I think that state leadership needs to take a stronger position with respect to demanding that they be at the table and cooperate with municipalities. I mean, it's just only to everyone's betterment that happens. And I will get off my soapbox.
Can you define what a road adaptation is?
Yeah, so road adaptation is that, as an example, so, as we identified, Market Street is in the traffic improvement program, which is funded by the federal government, money that goes to the state to improve existing roadways. Market Street is in the tip for 2022 or 2023 to simply repave it. And when we question DOT is, what is that? And they're like, we're just going to repave the road. Well, if we're talking about that road is going to be underwater constantly in the next 14 years, from a cost benefit analysis, is that the smartest way to spend this money? So road adaptation is, do you lift the road? Do you create more culverts? I mean, what do you do to not waste money. I mean, is it a causeway, whatever that strategy is. This country does not have road adaptation strategies. Again, there's isolated ones. There in Rhode Island, there was a small project on Block Island. There's some in South County. That's it. There's some in Florida. There's some in Louisiana. Europe has great road adaptation strategies. They've been doing it for 2,000 years. So I mean, it's just, you know, our whole purpose of this program is to be proactive and not reactive. So we're breaking some eggs as we go along, but in our conversations, and Teresa's been great in joining us with this, with DOT. I mean, what we create as a playbook here for road adaptation strategies will be something the entire state will use for road adaptation strategies. So that's just because we're loud and we're proud, and that we're saying, you know, we can't keep ignoring this. So we don't know specifically what that strategy is yet because we haven't identified it, but we know we need one.
Thanks.
So if there aren't any other questions, I mean, thanks for coming out. And for those of you that have been to 3 or 4 of these, there's only been 3, Brant, but it probably felt like 4.
Introduction.
Yeah, I mean, we appreciate that. I mean, for those people that are on YouTube or look at this later on YouTube, we appreciate it. I mean, you know, we know we're out in front on this, and, you know, not everyone lives in the crazy head that I have in terms of how we see this, but, you know, I think that we're moving in the right direction. You know, the fact that we have the interest that we got for SNEP to fund this because they thought it could be replicated, the interest that we have from the federal delegation now, that's important. I mean, that's a currency that we're going to use, and we're going to continue to leverage that. The partnership that we have with URI is critical to this success because, again, you know, we talk about, you know, we have these assets in the state with the Coastal Institute, University of Rhode Island. You know, we're a small town. We don't have a lot of money. We leverage every asset that we can, and you give us $1, we'll give you $2 back. That's, you know, kind of how we've been operating, and it's been working for us. So thank you. Thank you to Arnold, and thank you to Unity Studios.